haven't guessed already, this webinar is about contamination, brownfield cleanup, and also money. So thank you for joining our webinar. And again, we're going to talk about local brownfield financing. And in this session, you're going to learn a couple of things: the main types of brownfields grants, what types of sites and project are eligible for grantees or other free technical services or for grants, and what factors are important when you're competing for these grants. So you'll also see a couple of examples of projects that have received grants. So again, we should have time for questions at the end, but if you're like me and you can't wait till the end because you'll forget what your question was on slide 4, feel free to put it in the chat, and some of us who aren't speaking at the time may even be able to answer them kind of as we go along. So either method works. So here's who the panelists are today. I'm, again, Kristen Lukes, and I'm representing DEED, which is the statewide program that we're going to talk about today. And we also have representatives from regional and county grant programs. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. And then, do we have another poll, Marcus, or?
Yes.
Okay, and then we're going to have another poll after the introductions. So Rick, do you want to start?
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Rick Howden. I am an economic development specialist with Ramsey County and administer our environmental response fund.
Lance?
Hi, this is Lance Robinette. I work for Hennepin County in the Contaminated Lands Unit. We are basically the internal consultant for Hennepin County properties, and we also administer through our unit the environmental response fund grants.
I'm Marcus Martin. I work for the Metropolitan Council, and I work on the grant program that's called the Tax-Based Revitalization Account. Sometimes it's called TBRA.
All right. Do we have another poll that we have results? Another question pop up on?
So we do. We are starting out with kind of where people are working from. You know, a lot of people work from home. They work in different parts of the state, I imagine, too, sometimes, you know. So go ahead and put that in if you want to see kind of where people are joining us from today. Put in a little countdown. All right, so a lot from the metro area. It's a little bit from North Central. I put Wisconsin up there thinking there might be someone. There's got to be some Scotties out there. Right, all right. Well, we've got some diversity here in terms of where people are working from. I'm going to close this a little earlier, and we'll go on to our next poll question. And that is, what type of organization do you represent? Which is a little bit easier for us to kind of make sure that we are meeting your needs. We know what kind of work that you do. All right, so we got a good variety here of folks that are joining us. That's really great. Hopefully you'll find this interesting and it'll fit your needs here for kind of work that you do with contamination. I'm thinking most of you are familiar with what a brownfield is, but for those of you that aren't, essentially a brownfield is a place, a property that is significantly difficult to use because of real or perceived environmental contamination. So you think it's there, or you know it's there, and that's making it hard to use, develop that property. I did put the EPA definition there on the right. I'm not going to go over the legal part there, but I just wanted to point that out, that there are very specific legal terms for those things that are highlighted in blue there, hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. So we don't need to get into that today, but just know that does exist. There are two main types of financing available for brownfields: environmental investigation and cleanup. So you may be asking yourself, what type of grant should I choose? Should I choose an investigation grant or a cleanup grant? Or maybe you are more familiar with the development process and you may be asking yourself, where do the grants fit in that process? So typically, environmental investigation is part of due diligence. It is, happens before you're buying a property. And so in brownfield terms, that is the all appropriate inquiries, bona fide protective purchaser. Those are terms that are the brownfield equivalent of due diligence, but there are other things that go into that as well. So that's an opportunity for a brownfield, a grant or a brownfield intervention of some sort. Lance, you want to tell us a little bit more?
Sure. Just remember Hennepin County has a couple of other options. Yes, you can come into the ERF for just a assessment grant, or remember we also have other programs out there. One of them is through Minnesota Brownfields, where you can go and potentially get funding for phase 1, phase 2 if a project is just starting off. And then we also have internal programs, the MOA and COA, Memo of Agreement, and with past EPA grants that were run through Hennepin County, loans that we use that interest coming back as funding for other potential investigation activities.
So Lance, as we move out of the investigation and we get into kind of other phases of the development process, let's say you've already bought your property, you've done some planning already. We're kind of right before demo. Is there anything there?
We will help with asbestos and lead-based paint activities for basically projects that have an affordable housing aspect to them.
Okay, I know we're going to get more into the details of that later on. So Rick, let's say that demo's done, the building's down, but there's still something that needs to be done. How else could the grants help out here?
Yeah, these cleanup grants can also help pay for the costs related to contaminated soil or even soil vapor issues, as is often found as a way to mitigate those. So these grants can be very important when putting together a development budget.
Great. Yeah, I think there's a lot that can go on before you reach the construction stage.
So in the spring, we will have about $8 million in grants to offer. And this year, since May 1st is on a Saturday, all the applications will be due to deed on May 3rd. Lance, when are your applications due at Hennepin County?
Applications coming through are due to Hennepin County on May 3rd this year for the spring round. Just a reminder that if you're coming through the city of Minneapolis, applications are due the city of Minneapolis or March 8th.
So that's some kind of a pre-application of sorts.
Yep.
All right. Rick?
Yeah, so Ramsey County also will have applications due on May 3rd. Again, we are trying to transition into an online application platform through Zoom grants. So look for that link in the coming weeks here.
All right, fantastic. So the Metropolitan Council is also the applications are also due on May 3rd. So we try to do it all together to make it easier for you to decide, and so that we can hear about all the projects that people are interested in doing in the spring.
So the amount of funding available may be divided among one or more grant types. So DEED, for instance, offers both investigation and cleanup grants twice a year, and that's in May and November. We also like to disperse our funding statewide. So We have a goal of 35% of our funding to go outside of the metro area and go into greater Minnesota. So, and we usually have per grant round around 4 million. Sometimes it's a little bit more. It's almost never less. And then we're going to skip over the MPCA column here in yellow for a second and skip on to Marcus.
Thank you. The Metropolitan Council also offers investigation and cleanup grants, just like DEED. We have a third type of grant, a seed grants, that can be used for either investigation or cleanup. In that case, or in any case, I should say, your site has to be in one of the nearly 60 cities participating in the local housing incentives program. So to be eligible to apply, you have to be part of one of those. Your project, rather, has to be part of one of those cities.
Yeah, and I just want to add, if you are applying for DEED funding and your site is located in the metro area, you also must be one of those 60 or so cities as well. Obviously, that's not relevant in outside of the metro.
You can apply for an investigation or cleanup grant from Hennepin County. Don't forget about our Minnesota Brownfields program. You can get investigation grant for sites in Hennepin County anytime through the year from them. Rick?
Yeah, and unfortunately, Ramsey County doesn't allow for investigation, but we do soil cleanup grants and also hazardous abatement in existing buildings. So we do, however, refer folks who come and inquire about investigation to the Met Council seed program, as that has been beneficial as well. So
Nice. And the investigation grants from the MPCA that are highlighted in yellow, they're actually not grants at all. They're a little bit different where the MPCA does the contracting for you, but we're going to talk about the details of that just a little bit later.
So investigation, let's start there. Finding out about contamination helps people know the potential risks to your health based on how the property was used before, what to do about those risks depending on how you will use the property in the future. And it also offers an estimate usually of what it will cost to make the site safe for use again. So let's look at what kind of work is eligible to be paid for one of the investigation grants that we just talked about, that at least for those that do offer that type of grant.
So for programs that do offer grants for investigations, is there anything on this list that you won't pay for? Like, for instance, DEED won't pay for that last bullet, the asbestos assessments or any kind of building materials assessments. Lance or Marcus?
Hennepin County can pay for all the activities on the list, but remember, we only pay for asbestos assessments or lead-based paint assessments for sites owned by nonprofits.
So the Metropolitan Council can pay for all of the things on this list. We even include things like phase 2 work plans. I'm sure others do as well.
So for DEED, we can spend up to $500,000 a year statewide on investigations. However, our maximum award amount per site is $50,000 or 75% of the investigation cost, whichever is less, because there is that 25% match. And again, we offer those twice a year. How about Met Council?
Yes, the grant limits per site and the matching amount for the Metropolitan Council investigation are the same as what DEED uses for their investigation grants. We typically have a little bit less to spend, so we will be offering half of the amount that we have for the year, $125,000 for investigation grants this spring, and the rest in the fall. Lance, how about Hennepin County? What amounts are available for investigation?
Yeah, for Hennepin County, the amount varies, If you represent a nonprofit, you should apply through the Minnesota Brownfields Gap Financing Program. We typically start people off there. The maximum investigation request in Minnesota Brownfields is $25,000 per site. If you do not represent a nonprofit, you can apply directly to Hennepin County. The maximum request is $50,000, and there's no match required.
All right, thank you.
So to kind of circle back to those MPCA, the MPCA program that we talked about earlier, the MPCA has about $200,000 right now to spend using their targeted brownfield assessment program for investigations. And again, the main difference on that program is that the MPCA hires their own contractors and actually does the phase 1 and phase 2 and wrap work, and then gives you the results in a report. So the Minnesota Targeted Brownfield Assessment Program, or MNTAP, is run through the VIC program. So people can apply for that grant on a rolling basis. So there's no like May 1, November 1 time frame on that. So the grant can also pay for hazardous material surveys inside of the buildings. There are specific applicants for that program. So you have to be a municipal government, county government, a tribe, or a nonprofit. And the last thing is active Superfund sites aren't eligible. The MPCA is looking for all kinds of projects for this and all types of sites. So you'll learn a little bit later on how a lot of the competitive grant programs are looking for future developments, but the MPCA can do all types of sites. So sites that are going to be greenfields, like parks or trails or open space. They have a preference for sites outside the metro area. They also like to see sites in fund sites in environmental justice areas and sites where, again, there's no redevelopment plan. They like to toot their horn to say that they have the shortest application of all of us. Apparently it's only 4 pages long.
Wow.
And Shauna Schmidt at the MPCA kind of is coordinating that program right now, and we're going to give her information at the end of the presentation here.
So we talked a little bit about the investigation grants, the different varieties that are available. I want to focus a little bit on one particular one, that hybrid one that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So as Kristen mentioned, some of the grants require that a developer be involved with the site before you are ready to apply for it. But maybe a site that could be redeveloped, a site like this one here on the slide, this abandoned store, but you don't have a developer interested yet. If finding out what type of environmental problems there are would help this site be redeveloped, it could be a candidate for a Metropolitan Council seed grant. This is a site off of West Broadway. This site got an asbestos grant for an asbestos survey and doing some additional environmental investigation work, both on that vacant store and some of the lots behind it in the photo. But if you already have a development plan for the site, you should really consider applying to one of the other TBRA grant types, either that investigation or cleanup grant. If you aren't sure, just send me a note and we can talk about it and find the right one for you. So seed grants are intended to encourage more investment in areas of concentrated poverty. Here's a map showing those areas. We have a mapping tool on our website that can help you identify if your project area is within a target area for this type of grant. So this is just an example. This is not a live link, but we can add that link in the chat later. If you are familiar with those environmental justice areas that the PCA uses, these are similar to that, but just in the metro area. So let's take a look now at cleanup grants. Cleanup grants offer financial help managing contaminated soil, soil vapor, asbestos, and lead-based paint, and sometimes pre-treating contaminated groundwater. for properties that will involve either new construction or significant rehabilitation. These grants, just like the others, are competitive. We usually get 1.5 to 2 times or more the number of grants that we can fund. Rick, do you want to tell us a little bit about kind of the types of projects that cleanup grants help?
Yeah, absolutely, Marcus. Brownfield grants help with a variety of development types that include industrial, office, retail, apartment or multifamily housing, both market rate and affordable, and in some cases, open space as well.
So if you're still wondering which program might be right for you, we are going to do some side-by-side comparisons of each of the programs, and the differences are going to be highlighted in red to make that stand out for you. So for deed funding, again, we can do public or privately owned sites, although the public entity has to be the applicant. We can do soil or groundwater cleanups, vapor. We can do some demolition on a case-by-case basis, but through our cleanup program, we can also reimburse for investigation costs. If you move forward and didn't seek funding for your investigation costs and kind of foot the bill for that yourself, we can reimburse for those costs. Again, we have a 25% match. That's the difference between us and many of the other programs. There's no maximum award amount, and our grant terms are about 3 years.
For the Metropolitan Council, we are very similar to deed. So we offer kind of a lot of the same types of uses for the grants. As been called out before, we do offer some additional uses, particularly the hazardous building materials surveys and asbestos and lead-based paint abatement. We don't require a match, but deed does. So just know that these grants are often used together. And I know we have a question from Gail in the chat, and Gail, we are going to get to that here, maybe a couple questions, but I am going to advance to the county slides where we take a look at those.
Yep, for Hennepin County, we pretty much the same. Soil and groundwater cleanups, soil vapor mitigation, limited demolition. And what I mean by limited demolition is if there is a cleanup activity under a portion of the building that is required to be cleaned up in the wrap. We will not pay for the demolition of the entire building, but we will potentially fund the portion of the building that needs to be demolished to take care of those activities. And also remember, asbestos and lead-based paint abatement, we will fund those, but they have to have an affordable housing project aspect to the project. There is no matching fund required, and typically 2 years from the issue of the contract to use the funds. Rick?
Yeah, Ramsey County is very similar to Hennepin County. Soil or groundwater cleanup, vapor mitigation, asbestos and lead-based paint abatement as well. And ours is not limited to affordable housing projects. So typically, the ERF funding is funding of last resort as well. So we typically help provide matches to deed and Met Council grants.
So I know that we had a couple questions in the chat there. We might be, I'm hearing some clicking, so maybe answering those right now. Does anyone want to kind of just maybe voice maybe what those questions are, or an answer to those questions as well for people that are seeing it?
Thank you. I was the one clicking away over here to answer the question about the deed funding. The question is, if you pay for investigation costs on your own and qualify for reimbursement, do you still have to apply by May 3rd, or can you apply throughout the year? So the way that works with the reimbursement for investigation through cleanup is you would apply under a cleanup grant in May 1st or November 1st cycle. And then if your investigation costs weren't previously paid by another grant source, you can include those investigation costs as part of your cleanup application. So yes, you do have to apply during the regular grant rounds.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And we will have our contact information at the end. So if people want to contact any of us directly to talk about our specific programs, that's great.
All right, well, let's just talk a little bit more about just kind of how you get started. Both the past use and the future use will affect your cleanup plan and the grant options that will work best for you. So if you are thinking about applying for a cleanup grant, start by thinking about what you know about your development site. We will want to know about the contaminants and how you propose to do the cleanup. We will also want to know how you intend to use the site in the future and what type of uses will be going on there, what type of occupants there will be. You know, maybe you'll know this, maybe you won't, but those are the types of questions that we are going to be interested in. So next, we're going to kind of get into a lot of the individual grant criteria, starting with D.
All right. So as Marcus said, they're competitive grant programs, and all the grants compete against everything else that comes in that grant round. So what do we look at? So for deed, we look at quite a few things, as you can see in our little Brady Bunch diagram here. So we look for sites that have a high level of contamination and that's expensive to mitigate. We also look at removing blight in the communities. So we look at sites that have maybe neglected or blighted structures on them that will need to be removed. So we look at the future construction at the sites because we're deed and we're all about economic development and economic parameters. We look at is the site going to increase the current tax base to the local community? Is it going to add jobs? And then really, is it ready to go? We have grant rounds every 6 months. So we want to know that your project is going to start the cleanup, you know, hopefully before the next grant round. And then shortly thereafter, your construction project is going to begin. So we are also looking for sites. We also look at the need. So we want to know that there's no other sources to pay for these costs. And we also want to have a commitment to local support. So each application has to submit a resolution from the local entity and that our grantees are the locals. But if you're a private property owner, you can apply through the city. And I think we talked about that a little bit earlier. The other thing that the locals commit to is that match.
So for the Metropolitan Council, for those of you that are familiar for our grants, we have reorganized how we look at the criteria. There are a lot of similar factors. There are a couple new ones, but we have organized our grant evaluation to kind of 3 major themes. What outcomes we expect to achieve, how each project works with the local community, and who makes up the project team. So I'm using those same, person said it was the Brady Bunch slide. We're doing that. 8 is enough, maybe, for those of you that need an older reference, maybe. The Metropolitan Council is looking for sites that are significantly contaminated and within areas that have a disproportionate amount of cleanup needed. We are also looking for sites that offer options for taking transit or alternatives like biking and walking. Sites that offer access to parks and trails. These sites, it could be vacant sites within a developed area or redevelopment sites or places where reusing the existing building makes the most sense. Either one of those. The council is looking for future construction on those sites that includes an increase in the tax base, just like deed. So if your site is tax exempt, you would have to commit to making payments in lieu of taxes or it wouldn't be eligible. The council is looking for future construction on those sites that includes an increase in the tax base, just like deed. So if your site is tax exempt, you would have to commit to making payments in lieu of taxes or it wouldn't be eligible. We also are looking for sites that add jobs, again, like the particularly living wage jobs. And we measure living wage based on a sliding scale. It's going to be 185% of the poverty level, I believe. So anyways, that kind of detail will be in the application material. We are also interested in developments that offer opportunities for micro businesses or ownership models that support wealth creation, particularly for owners or tenants that could be considered equitable development. Or asset-based development in areas of high unemployment or concentrated poverty. So if that isn't enough, we're also looking for sites that could add affordable housing. We're looking for housing that is affordable to households at 60% of the area median income or less. We're looking for site design that uses low impact designs for managing stormwater and or use of renewable energy. The council is in particular interested in how you identified the need for future redevelopment. That's new this year. We are doing more of an emphasis on how the development team has conducted its community engagement, how the development meets a previously expressed local need, and how can the project demonstrate financial support and viability for the proposed development. So all of those things are things that we are interested in, as well as what will be developed on the site. Lastly, the council is looking for confirmation that the applicant and development team have the capacity to manage the project and spend the funding soon. Kristen mentioned that, hopefully we do offer the grants relatively frequently. And so we're looking for projects that are pretty ready to get started. And if they're not, there's another round coming up. There are some reporting requirements if a grant is awarded. They're not that big of a deal from my point of view. Hopefully you would feel the same if you got one of these grants. All right, now that's a mouthful and a lot of things, but hopefully that will make some more sense as we move on. All right, next up, Hennepin County.
So Hennepin County is looking for sites that are significantly contaminated or located on infield, brownfield properties or orphan sites that are neglected and in noticeable disrepair, adding blight to the community, and also demonstrate that they are shovel ready to begin cleanup and or construction. The county is looking for future constructions on those sites that include municipal and other public development projects or affordable housing projects where contamination issues preclude redevelopment. We also look at projects to promote economic development. The county also prioritizes development that includes sustainable features and activities in the project's design, construction, and operation. Much like Marcus said, we're looking at green energy sources, stormwater infiltration features, planting of trees to shade paved areas to prevent the urban heat buildup, things of those nature. Just a little hint, typically we don't need to see on the application about low VOC paints and Energy Star appliances. With that, let Rick go.
Yeah, so pretty similar for Ramsey County as well. Obviously, given the need for additional housing stock, our county board would like to prioritize affordable housing when it comes to our environmental response fund as well. We also do accept projects that attract businesses and create jobs, increase tax base overall. We're also looking to remove unsafe and unhealthy properties and mitigate those. We're looking for readiness, being able to get the project going within 18 months. And typically that hasn't been an issue for many applications. So, and then also it's a little lower of a priority, but have the ability to clean up public land and green space with our environmental response fund as well. And so, again, we also are looking for a financing gap in the project and Yeah, I think that wraps it up for my part here.
So I will add that what we are showing you are all of the kind of factors that make for a very competitive, very likely to be selected for award type of project, type of application. We don't necessarily need all the applications to have all of the things that we've shown you. Some of these things are a little bit either or, some of it you can have a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But in general, the more of these elements that you have in your application, the more likely that your project would be selected for funding. So we are going to take a look at an example. We're going to start with an example in Ramsey County. This is a site, an example of a situation where I would say kind of looks can be deceiving, if you've ever heard that phrase before. This is the Edison Apartments redevelopment site in Roseville. Roseville applied for a grant on behalf of a nonprofit housing developer. The site had been vacant for an extended amount of time. It had lots of trees and shrubs on it. And there was even a BMX bike course hidden in the middle of it. So that's probably a good use for a site like that. Till you find out that it's contaminated. So contamination was suspected and later confirmed to be in the fill soil. There was some soil vapor testing that had been done, but another set of samples was needed. So let's look at how grantors evaluate that type of information, the cleanup information. If your project will involve managing contaminated soil or soil vapor before you apply, you will need a cleanup plan. For those of you that don't know, that's known as sometimes as a response action plan or a RAP. And you will need regulatory approval for your plan from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So that is a key prerequisite. Grantors will be looking at the summary results like the figure shown here. We are looking at the type, location, and severity of the contamination. As you can see from the map key at the bottom of the slide, it is important to know if your future project will include a residential use or a commercial industrial use. The standards are slightly different for those. Kristen, do you want to tell us a little bit about how DEED would look at this site?
In addition to what Marcus just mentioned, we're also going to look to see if there is someone likely responsible for the contamination found at the site, also known as the responsible party, which I was joking a couple of weeks ago about, wouldn't it be an irresponsible party if they contaminated the site? But that's neither here nor there. So we're going to look at that. And then if there is a responsible party, they're not necessarily ineligible. The site isn't necessarily ineligible, but we would want to know that that responsible party is contributing to the cleanup in some way. We're also going to look at how contaminated the site is and how that proposed cleanup in the response action plan is going to mitigate that contamination. And all of our applications go over to the MPCA for review, so they kind of help us out with that. And then we're also going to look at the cost and also the reasonableness of the cleanup itself.
So the Metropolitan Council is going to look at the same things that DEED looked at. To get a high score, your site needs to be more contaminated than your competitors. When it comes to cost, the Metropolitan Council looks at a ratio. We look at where the total cleanup costs, they must be over 1% of the total development costs. So not necessarily the amount that you're asking for from us, but the total amount that it's going to take to clean up that site. Rick, can you tell us just a little bit about how Ramsey County looks at cleanup in general?
Very similar.
Okay.
I don't think I have any additional. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Wonderful. Let's maybe switch over to the development side. Rick, can you tell us kind of maybe like now that we know we've heard about the cleanup, what about the future project, the construction?
Yeah, absolutely. Although there are some differences between the grant programs, we all want to learn how the future development will meet community development and economic development goals. And some of those common goals include increasing the tax base, adding jobs, adding affordable housing, development of vacant or abandoned or orphan sites, infill sites, and projects that are ready to start construction within at least 2 years. And would anyone like to add something about how we evaluate those development proposals?
Sure, I have something to add. So for deed and the way that we look at jobs, and again, I kind of alluded to this earlier, that we compare all the projects to whatever else is in. So sometimes we might get a question like, well, I have 4 jobs. Will that qualify, or do I need a lot of jobs? Well, it just sort of depends on what other applications are in that grant round. And we also run a ratio for jobs and taxes. So the amount of funds that you're requesting versus the taxes and jobs that you're producing are run as a ratio. So you don't have to be a huge project, and you don't necessarily have to have a ton of jobs. It's just kind of based, again, what everybody else's project that's in that grant round has.
I'll add that sometimes we get requests for rather large sites that are going to be developed in phases. So typically we actually like to take one phase at a time rather than making a commitment to the whole site. Lance, do you have anything you want to add before we look at an example in Hennepin County?
Not really. I think you pretty much covered it.
Okay.
Much different.
All right. Well, let's look at another example.
So this is a grant evaluation of a site history for Hennepin County. This project made use of an EPA assessment funding allocated by Hennepin County. I think it both went through the Minnesota Brownfields and the MOACOA programs that we have, and then later applied to the ARF program and Metropolitan Council TBR grant programs on behalf of the Red Lake Band of Chippewa Nation. It's nearly a 1-acre site that included 4 parcels and 7 buildings that had been used for a variety of commercial and industrial contractors, and was most recently used for surplus hardware, machinery, and steel recycles, Amble's Hardware. For the county ERF and the TBRA program, to get a high score, you have to demonstrate significant cleanup is needed. Contamination was suspected and later confirmed to be in the soil and soil vapor. The cleanup required demolition of the buildings, removal of the contaminated soil, and adding a subslab depressurization system. Below a future underground parking garage. Due to the size of the site and the petroleum contaminations, finding the right place for infiltrating stormwater would be a challenge.
I don't know if there's anything else that came up for that site, Lance, in terms of the, it certainly had a lot of issues. Anything in particular stood out that we missed?
I think soil vapor was the biggest issue that we had run across, and I think they also ran into some regulated fill as they were doing the excavation as well.
Okay, let's take a look at kind of how the development outcomes. So we talked about the cleanup now. Let's talk about the cleanup need. Let's talk about the development.
Yep. So the grant evaluation, when we go through evaluate, we consider the grant application. We look at affordable housing aspect, sustainable features, and increase of the tax base or other economic development. So we look at, potential for future job creation. Like I said, affordable housing is the biggest part. This $4.15 million project was developed into 110 units of affordable apartments and includes a wellness center. the Red Lake Nation Embassy, and lots of open space for the residents. To get a high score based on the development, you need to show, high contamination values, as many as the criteria you can hit, as it has to do with sustainable features, increases in tax base, and overall economic development.
And I'll say for the council, it really is the same kinds of things. We're looking at those. If you offer affordable housing, if you offer that tax increase, what kind of sustainable features are there? Maybe they're, in this case, it's a mixed use. So if you have benefit of jobs on that site as well, all are favorable. So these are the common criteria. There are some similar evaluation criteria used by each of the programs. So if your project has these common characteristics, that could be a sign that it's a good candidate for multiple grant sources. So in general, for expensive cleanup projects, you can often stack the funding from multiple sources, right? Get 2 maybe grants, maybe 3 grants. But if you are looking for investigation funding, we suggest that you only pick one source. Don't try to divide that among multiple sources. So we have a couple minutes to go here. We wanted to get to some questions, some frequently asked questions. Did we have any more questions in the chat there that we can answer before we get to some of the ones that we see a lot?
Okay, I do see a question, and that is, do you consider a project to add to the tax base if it's an empty, abandoned building now, but they are paying property tax? We would be adding sales tax, income tax, and probably the city's commercial tax property. So how does everybody look at that as far as tax increase?
You want to start with them? Your response first for Deed, then we'll maybe chime in.
Sure. So we just look at property tax, and we just take whatever taxes are being paid on that abandoned site now, and then your best guess at what the new development is going to create in property taxes, and we just simply subtract those and count the difference. So that's how we look at it, but we don't look at like sales tax or income tax or any business taxes for the company that's going to occupy the site.
So the Metropolitan Council looks at it the same way. We really focus just on the property taxes, kind of pre-post. Maybe in an example like that, the tenant improvements would increase the tax base somewhat. So you'll still have a noticeable change. That would be the best. How about any other ways that Hennepin or Ramsey look at this kind of?
No, we look at it the same way. We're looking at the increase in property tax. We don't look at sales tax and income tax and things of those natures. We do kind of look at if the project is also going to have tax increment financing.
Yes, good point. Tax increment financing. Rick?
Yeah, we look at it the same, and I'll just add that I think it's a factor in making our determination. It's not if there's a substantial enough increase that then we can move it forward. But if it's adding jobs and hitting some of those other priorities, it's not a deal breaker, if you will. But we do look at it the same way, and would count the tenant improvements, like Marcus mentioned, as adding value to it. So, yeah.
All right, so good point, right? So this is one criteria of those many different criteria that we have, but good question. Do we get any other questions in the chat?
I don't see anything from my end.
All right, well, let's start going with maybe a couple of the most common ones. I know we are scheduled to end here in a couple minutes, so if we lose a few of you all, I will be sending out the slides here to folks that do it, and we may even be able to put a recording up if I'm technically savvy enough here. So if we don't lose you, if we do lose you rather, we really appreciate you joining us today. But let's get into some of the questions that we often get. So the question is, I am a for-profit or a nonprofit developer. How do I apply for a grant? So this is a question we get a lot, but really is more of a process situation. You have to be enrolled in the PCA. You have to kind of choose one of those grant types. Hopefully we've given you some guidance on that, kind of narrow down which of the sources would work best for you. But in some cases, you can apply directly to the grantors, like the county programs. Other cases you cannot, and you're going to need a public sponsor. If you're a private developer, you're also going to be involved in filling out the draft application form, and you're often going to be required to compile a lot of the required attachments. So there is quite a bit of work involved sometimes if you're a developer, but that might be expected. All right, someone else want to take one of these questions here?
Sure, I'll take this question, and then I do have a question in the chat room.
All right.
So this question is, can any of the grants be used for renovation in addition to new construction? So I thought this was going to be a hard no, so that's why I decided to take this question, but I see here on the slide that maybe I'm not the best person to answer it. We don't do renovation specifically in any of these programs or do construction activities, but as the slide says, Met Council and the county programs, Hennepin County can do asbestos or lead paint abatement prior to that renovation, and DEED does not do that, those abatement activities. And sometimes with cleanup, even with soil and groundwater cleanup, there's kind of a fine line between what's a cleanup cost and what's a construction cost. So we always look at all of those things on kind of a case-by-case basis.
Sure.
Yeah, and for Hennepin County with the lead-based paint and asbestos, if the building's gonna be renovated again, it has to have a affordable housing component, but that would be something we would look at and grade and potentially fund.
Good clarification. Thank you. Yeah, so we don't pay for construction, but we can pay for some of these pre-construction activities. All right, we're going to take one more, and then I'll jump down to our contact information. But you will have lots more of these frequently asked questions in the slide deck when we send them out. Okay.
Can I just interject? There's a question for DEED in the box.
Oh,
that
good.
Asks about how DEED, I know DEED's the only dinosaur that has paper copies. And so the question is, how is DEED handling delivery of hard copies of the applications given the pandemic? We are still taking hard copies, and we have a cart like in our front office area on the day that the applications are due. And you can also call our office and someone can meet you down near the lobby to pick up your application if you're dropping it off early, but we are still taking hard copies.
Okay, so you can mail it in, you can hand deliver it, you can courier it in. Those are all things you could do. Okay, all right.
Thank you.
So should you apply for more than one grant? So as we mentioned, if you're looking for investigation funding, no, you shouldn't. But if you're looking for cleanup funding, yes, you should. Try it if you can. All right, so we have a lot of options that we've already seen here for depending on where your project is located. How much should I ask for? All right, well, you should ask for what you need, but you really should think about, again, those kind of eligible uses. Make sure that the type of cleanup or type of help that you need is something that grant program can pay for. Think a little bit about the funding limits. You may have a maximum amount that you're going to run into. We just talked about kind of stacking funds, applying for more than one source. Think about those matching requirements, in terms of maybe you want to see which ones have it, which ones don't. Are you meeting the minimum amounts? And lastly, those program priorities. Will your new development, your construction, will it meet a lot of those public goals, those public priorities that we've talked about? These are kind of some of the average amounts that we have paid out for projects. You don't have to ask for this amount. It can be different than this. But just to give you a sense of kind of what people have asked us before, we are going to touch on here those matching amounts. I see. Maybe I'll start with you, Kristen, and then we'll go ahead here and finish it.
Sure. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to comment on the previous slide.
Oh, let's go back.
With the average amounts. So for deed, although that's the average request amount and the average award, we do grants of all sizes. We can do a cleanup grant, as little as, $50,000, or we have given grants that are over $1 million. So don't think, oh, I just have to stay in right around that $350,000 range, because they're everywhere. That's just the average. So.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. And then on the next slide, deed has a statutory, it's not a requirement, but it's a goal of awarding at least 35% of our funds outside of the metro area. If we don't get sufficient applications in either Greater Minnesota or Metro, we can flip-flop those and spend the money. We could spend all the money in Greater Minnesota or all in the Metro if needed. We do have some flexibility, but our goal is at least 35% out of the Metro.
The Metropolitan Council is looking to spend at least a quarter of the funding we make available, 25% in suburban areas. But just like Deed, if we don't get enough of those, we will program it other places, but hopefully we can. Rick, did you want to talk a little bit about target areas?
Yeah, we try to maintain a balance between St. Paul and the rest of Ramsey County, often referred to as suburban Ramsey County. So when looking into it in the past few years, there have been more projects in the city of St. Paul. So if you are working on a project in, say, Roseville or New Brighton or Shoreview, those would have an advantage over other applications to help us maintain that split between St. Paul and suburban Ramsey County.
All right, thank you. Well, we are 5 minutes over, so we are just going to kind of end here with our contact information. If we didn't answer your question, if we didn't really clarify the kinds of information that you feel you need to know, please contact us. We would be happy to help you figure out our grant programs and see if your project is a great candidate for those. So again, I know we have a lot of choices for your time, so we really appreciate you spreading it with us. And we will be sending out copies of the presentation materials and maybe a copy of this recording sometime for you soon too. All right, so we appreciate it, and we wish you have a great Friday.
Thank you, everyone.